Most people believe that the ultimate victory lies in conquering others. Rui discovered that everything changes the moment you dismantle the carefully constructed lies you tell yourself to survive your own failures. What happened next inside a freezing mountain dojo rewrote everything he thought he knew about honor, discipline, and the true weight of a warrior's spirit. He arrived at the summit carrying a pristine reputation, but he left behind the one thing he valued most: his comforting illusions. The answer to who he actually was did not live in his victories, but in the dark, unexamined spaces he had spent a lifetime defending. If you have ever felt that despite your best efforts, some unseen barrier keeps resetting your progress, you are looking at the exact same wall that almost destroyed Rui. The morning chill bit deep into the cedar walls of the remote mountain hermitage. Rui stood in the courtyard, adjusting the heavy silk of his hakama, with the practiced grace of a man who had never lost an official engagement. At 24 winters old, his name was spoken with hushed respect in the lower provinces. His strikes were precise, his forms flawless, and his tactical assessments during field exercises were studied by younger apprentices as models of perfect execution. By every external metric, Rui was the embodiment of a rising master. Yet, his own teacher had exiled him to this desolate peak, sending him to study under Torin, a retired elder who no longer carried a steel blade, only a worn wooden staff. Rui watched as Torin sat on a low bench, carefully mending a torn straw sandal with coarse hemp twine. The old man's movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely lacking the theatrical intensity Rui expected from a legendary strategist. There was no grand greeting, no formal acknowledgement of the young samurai's status. My master sent me here because he believes I must learn to see myself honestly, Rui said, his voice ringing flat against the cold stone. Torin did not look up from his knotwork. Do you believe him? Rui paused, his chin lifting slightly. I believe that he perceives a limitation in my perspective. I have always analyzed my engagements with strict rigor. Torin pulled the hemp twine tight, snapping the excess with a clean jerk of his weathered hands. That answer is precisely why your feet were directed up this trail. You have brought me a sword that is sharp, but a mirror that is warped by your own desire to remain comfortable. The old master stood up, his gaze locking onto Rui with an unsettling clarity that felt entirely devoid of malice, yet completely stripped of flattery. It was a level of observation that made Rui instantly uneasy, a sensation he had not felt since his first day holding a wooden practice blade. Every man who carries a blade has two lives, Torin said softly, stepping toward the center of the frosted dojo floor. The life he narrates to his peers, and the silent, ongoing fiction he whispers to his own soul. Tell me of your greatest tactical failure. Rui cleared his throat, leaning on a deeply ingrained narrative he had reviewed dozens of times. 2 seasons ago, my detachment was overrun at the Eastern River Pass. The scouting reports we received were fundamentally flawed, completely miscalculating the enemy's vanguard speed. Furthermore, the archer support assigned to my left flank delayed their volley by 3 crucial breaths, leaving our formation exposed to a swift cavalry sweep. I managed to rally 4 men and cut an exit path through the brush, but the position was lost. Torin listened, his expression as unreadable as the mountain rock. In everything you have just detailed, what was your personal contribution to that bloody defeat? I suffered a minor lapse in my timing while executing the fallback order, Rui replied smoothly, which cost us several yards of ground. But as I stated, the primary catalyst was the failure of intelligence and the hesitation of the auxiliary archers. And what was your contribution to the conditions that allowed those external failures to destroy you? Torin countered, his voice dropping an octave. Not the strike itself, Rui, the landscape that welcomed it. Rui opened his mouth to repeat the details of the flawed scouting report, but the words died in his throat. A heavy silence filled the space between them. I do not know, Rui finally murmured. That is the first shard of truth you have offered, Torin said, nodding toward the open doors. The story you hold in your mind has a very specific geometry. The shifting winds are central, the errors of your comrades are monumental, and your own identity is a small, blameless leaf caught in their wake. This is the flattering mirror. It does not lie by erasing the event. It lies by selecting only the evidence that keeps your pride intact. Tomorrow, you will recount the same river pass to me. But you will begin with the absolute certainty that you were the author of the ruin. But that was only the surface of the problem. The next morning, the exercise proved agonizing. Rui sat before Torin, forced to strip away the structural alibis he had lived with for months. Without the shield of the late archers and the bad scouts, he had to confront his own arrogance. He had chosen not to verify the reports himself, because he believed his reputation alone would intimidate the opposition. It feels like a distortion, Rui confessed 3 weeks into the training, his fingers white where they gripped his knees. When I remove the explanations, the inventory that remains makes me look reckless. I am uncovering traits that I find deeply distasteful. Torin smiled, a rare and fleeting movement of his lips. That burning in your chest is the sensation of reality breaking through the performance. Most men spend their entire lives engineering a magnificent distance between who they are and who they claim to be. They construct a second self, a character they perform not just for the lord of the manor, but for the person staring back at them from the wash basin. The old man gestured outside, where a low-ranking courier named Kyle had just arrived with a shipment of winter grain. Kyle was a loud, unrefined man, throwing the heavy sacks onto the wooden porch with an aggressive thud, his posture oozing a deep, unspoken resentment for having to climb the mountain trail. He did not bow to Torin, nor did he acknowledge Rui's formal crest. He simply muttered a coarse demand for payment, his eyes wandering lazily around the modest courtyard. Rui watched the interaction, his jaw tightening as his hand instinctively drifted toward where his sword would usually rest. He remained perfectly still, maintaining the serene, detached expression expected of a high-born warrior. In the presence of an elder, he did not speak a word of reprimand, keeping his breathing measured and his spine perfectly straight until Kale took his coins and shuffled back down the path. What did you observe about that man? Torin asked once the courier's footsteps faded. He lacks basic discipline, Rui said, his tone perfectly flat. His movements are inefficient, his posture carries a bitter weight, and his disrespect for this house is a clear indicator of a small mind. And what did you observe about yourself while he stood there? Rui blinked. I maintained my composure. I did not break form or grant his insolence the satisfaction of an outburst. Why did you withhold your tongue, Rui? Because you are my instructor, and it would be a violation of the dojo's peace to engage with a common laborer over a matter of simple manners. Torin stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. If I had been down in the valley, and that man had tossed a sack of grain at your boots, with no witnesses around, what would your composure have looked like? Rui hesitated, the phantom warmth of anger rising in his throat. I would have corrected him. Sharply, I would have used words designed to remind him precisely where his station ends and mine begins. Then the serenity you displayed just now was not your character, Torin said, his finger pointing directly at Rui's chest. It was an exhibition for my benefit. The version of you that appears when you believe no one of consequence is watching is the only version that possesses any historical truth. The restrained samurai is a costume you wear when the audience matches your ambitions. The man who wishes to humiliate a clumsy courier in the shadow of a valley, that is the actual territory we are trying to map. What Rui found next made the first lesson feel incomplete. He realized that his self-awareness was entirely conditional, applied only to the moments he deemed significant enough to be recorded. For a full week, Torin ordered him to keep an unwritten ledger of his private thoughts during the most tedious tasks, clearing the frozen latrines, carrying water in the dark, and cleaning the ash from the hearth. Rui discovered that when the performance pressure was removed, his mind was a storm of bitter judgments, subtle grievances, and constant calculations about how to regain his master's favor. The realization was devastating. The noble, detached warrior he thought he was existed only when there was an audience to validate the role. "I have completed the inventory as you asked," Rui told Torin as they sat by the dim embers of the hearth 4 months into his exile. "I see the performed self clearly now. I see how my patience vanishes the moment the task lacks glory. But knowing this only makes me feel paralyzed. I want to purge these weaknesses. I want to build a regimen to destroy this hidden pride." Torin shook his head slowly, reaching out to stir the dying coals with an iron rod. This is the precise trap where almost every serious apprentice loses his way. You have spent 4 months gathering accurate information, and your immediate instinct is to convert that information into a self-improvement project. You want to fix the map before you have even finished looking at the ground. Should a warrior not seek to eradicate his flaws? Rui asked, his voice raw with frustration. A warrior must first find the courage to stand on the ground that actually exists, Torin replied, looking up through the rising smoke. Self-improvement is often just a highly sophisticated form of self-deception. It allows you to look at an ugly truth and immediately comfort yourself by saying, "Ah yes, but I am already changing it." It installs a condition on your honesty. You will only look at your pride if you can promise yourself that tomorrow you will be humble. The old man stood up, walking to the edge of the dojo where the wind howled through the open valley. True self-knowledge, Jiko Ninshiki, requires an honest accounting without immediate amendment. You must hold the fact of your arrogance, your impatience, your fear, without immediately dressing it up as a problem to be solved. Can you sit with the plain statement of what you are, without reaching for a shield or a strategy to fix it? The answer was not where anyone expected it to be. 1 year after Rua's arrival, his original master rode up the mountain trail to observe his student's progress, expecting to see a warrior whose strikes had grown swifter or whose strategy had become more complex. The master found Rui sitting quietly in the courtyard, splitting firewood with a regular, unhurried rhythm. When Rui looked up to greet his old teacher, there was no performative flourish to his bow, no urgent desire to showcase his development, and no defensive explanations about why he was performing menial labor. His eyes were entirely steady, settled, and completely devoid of the restless ambition that had previously defined his every movement. Later that evening, the two elders sat together on the porch, watching Rui carry water buckets across the courtyard in the fading dusk. "His forms have not changed," the master observed, turning to Torin. "His technique appears exactly as it did when I sent him away. What did you do to him?" "I did nothing to his steel," Torin replied, his eyes fixed on the young man in the yard. "I simply broke his flattering mirror. He spent his entire life using his formidable intelligence to construct flawless explanations, for why his failures belonged to the world, and his victories belonged to him. I showed him how to look inward, not to flagellate himself, but to see the actual landscape of his mind. The master watched Rui set the buckets down, without a sound. And what did he find out there in the dark? He found a human being, Torin said softly. A man who is capable, but limited. A mind that is sharp, but prone to deep self-delusion. A spirit that is brave under the gaze of a lord, but small when left in the cold with a common courier. The difference is that he no longer wastes his life's blood maintaining a magnificent fiction. He is not a better swordsman than he was when he arrived on this mountain. He is simply a completely honest one. And the swordsmanship that grows from an accurate starting point will always cut through the performance of 100 pretenders. Rui had finally answered the open loop of his own exile. He had stopped performing his virtues and began owning his actual nature. The concrete reminder of his arrogance, the memory of the river pass, and his behavior toward the courier remained with him, but no longer as wounds to be hidden behind clever stories. They were the solid stone from which his real strength was now being forged. True self-awareness is not a flattering portrait, it is an unblinking gaze into the mirror when the light is at its harshest. It is the willingness to look at your deepest patterns, your private behaviors, and your bounded weaknesses, and say without an alibi, "This is where I begin." What is the one protective story about your own failures that you are finally ready to cross out? Subscribe to Presence and Purpose for ancient wisdom tested by time and confirmed by science. A new video every week. The next video reveals exactly why this level of radical honesty changes your psychology. It starts right now.